The acrid smell of burning rubber assaulted my nostrils as Joe's taillights disappeared into the darkness. I stood there stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. How could he do this to me? His own wife, left stranded in the middle of nowhere. "Joe!" I screamed, my voice echoing off the abandoned buildings surrounding me. "Joe, come back!" But he was gone, leaving me alone in this god-forsaken part of town. I hugged myself, trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The argument we'd had in the car played on repeat in my mind. "You're useless, Danny," Joe had sneered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Can't even keep the house clean? What kind of wife are you?" "I'm doing my best," I'd protested, fighting back tears. "Your mother." "Don't you dare bring my mother into this," he'd roared, slamming on the brakes. "Get out, now." I thought he was joking. He couldn't be serious, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. Cold, cruel, unfeeling. Now, as I stood on the cracked sidewalk, I realized just how far from home I was. My purse was still in the car, along with my phone. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the growing realization that my marriage was falling apart. A group of rough-looking men loitered on the corner, eyeing me with interest. I quickened my pace, searching desperately for a safe place. A diner, maybe, or a gas station, somewhere I could call for help. "Hey, lady," one of the men called out. "You lost?" I ignored him, walking faster. My heart raced as I heard footsteps behind me. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart." The voice growled closer now. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm me, I spotted a neon sign flickering in the distance. Salvation in the form of a 24-hour diner. I broke into a run, pushing through the door with a jingle of bells. The waitress behind the counter looked up, startled by my abrupt entrance. "You okay, hon?" I shook my head, fighting back tears. "Can I use your phone, please?" She nodded, gesturing to an ancient payphone in the corner. I fumbled with the receiver, trying to remember Ellie's number. My fingers shook as I dialed. "Hello?" Ellie's sleepy voice answered on the third ring. "Ellie," I choked out. "It's Danny. I need help." "Danny, what's wrong? Where are you?" I glanced around, searching for a street sign. "I don't know, some diner on the east side. Joe, he left me here." "He what?" Ellie's voice sharpened, sleep forgotten. "That bastard." "Okay, don't move. I'm coming to get you. What's the name of the diner?" I relayed the information, clinging to the phone like a lifeline. "Ellie, I don't know what to do. Things have gotten so bad." "We'll figure it out," she assured me. "Just stay put. I'll be there in 20 minutes. As I hung up, I caught my reflection in the grimy mirror above the payphone. I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. Pale, frightened, a far cry from the confident, independent person I'd been before marrying Joe. The waitress approached, concern etched on her weathered face. "Sugar, you want some coffee while you wait?" "On the house." I nodded gratefully, following her to a booth. As I sipped the bitter brew, my mind wandered to happier times. My job at the art gallery, my cozy apartment, friends who supported me. When had I lost all that? The answer came unbidden, the day I said I do to Joseph Ferguson. The bell above the door jingled, and I tensed, fearing Joe had returned. But it was only a tired-looking trucker, heading straight for the counter. I checked my watch. 15 more minutes until Ellie arrived. 15 minutes to decide what I was going to do next. Because one thing was certain, I couldn't go back to the way things were. As I waited, I made a silent vow to myself. This night, this humiliation, would be the last. Whatever it took, I would reclaim the woman I used to be. And Joe? Joe would regret the day he left me, standing alone in the dark. I stumbled through the front door, exhausted from the night's ordeal. Ellie had driven me home, insisting I call the police. But what would I say? That my husband had abandoned me in a dangerous part of town? I could already hear the skepticism in their voices. "There you are." A shrill voice pierced the air. "Where have you been?" "Joseph's been worried sick." I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. Patricia Macy, my mother-in-law, stood in the hallway, arms crossed and lips pursed in disapproval. Behind her, Joe lounged on the couch, looking anything but worried. "Pat," I said, forcing a smile, "I didn't expect you to be here." "Well, someone had to be here for Joseph," she sniffed, "since his wife couldn't be bothered." I bit back a retort, reminding myself that Pat didn't know the whole story. Or did she? The way Joe smirked from the couch made me wonder if he'd already spun some tale to make me look like the villain. "I'm sorry for worrying you," I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. There was a misunderstanding. Pat waved her hand dismissively. Never mind that now. The house is a mess, Danielle. I've been trying to tidy up, but my poor back. I glanced around the immaculate living room, then back at Pat's martyred expression. I'll take care of it, I said, resigned. As I moved towards the kitchen, Joe finally spoke. Bring me a beer, would you, babe? I clenched my fists, remembering his taillights disappearing into the night. But Pat was watching, her beady eyes missing nothing. I forced a nod and continued to the kitchen. The moment I was alone, I sagged against the counter, fighting back tears. How had my life come to this? Catering to a man who'd left me stranded, and a woman who seemed to delight in my misery? My phone buzzed in my pocket, Ellie checking in. I typed a quick response, assuring her I was okay. But was I? Really? Danielle! Pat's voice rang out. Where's Joseph's beer? I grabbed a can from the fridge and returned to the living room. Joe took it without a word of thanks, while Pat tutted about the state of the coffee table. Really, Danielle, I don't know how you expect to keep a husband if you can't even keep a tidy home, she said, running a finger along the spotless surface. I work full-time, Pat, I reminded her, my patience wearing thin. And I do my best to. Excuses, she interrupted. In my day, women knew how to balance work and home. Isn't that right, Joseph? Joe grunted in agreement, his eyes never leaving the TV. I felt something snap inside me. You know what? I said, my voice shaking. I'm done. I'm going to bed. Pat gasped as if I'd slapped her. But the dishes, and Joseph needs his dinner. I turned to Joe, who finally deigned to look at me. You left me alone in a dangerous neighborhood, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You can make your own damn dinner. With that, I stormed upstairs, ignoring Pat's sputtering protests. I slammed the bedroom door behind me, my heart racing. What had I done? My phone buzzed again, another message from Ellie. You okay? Need me to come over? I hesitated, then typed back, No, but can we meet for lunch tomorrow? I need to talk. Her response was immediate. Absolutely. Usual place at 12:30? I agreed, then sank onto the bed, my mind whirling. Something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells in my own home. A soft knock at the door made me jump. Danny? It was Joe, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Can we talk? I stared at the door, torn between hope and suspicion. Was this a peace offering, or just another manipulation? With a deep breath, I stood up. Whatever happened next, one thing was clear. Things couldn't go on as they had been. It was time to take a stand. The alarm blared, jolting me awake. Another day in paradise, I thought bitterly. Joe's side of the bed was cold. He hadn't come up last night after our confrontation. Part of me was relieved, but another part ached for the man I'd fallen in love with years ago. I dragged myself out of bed, dreading the day ahead. As I stepped into the hallway, Pat's voice drifted up from downstairs. Joseph, darling, you really should talk to Danielle about her behavior. It's simply unacceptable. I froze, straining to hear Joe's response. I know, Mom. I'll handle it. My stomach churned. Handle it? Like he'd handled leaving me stranded in a dangerous neighborhood? I showered and dressed quickly, determined to leave before facing either of them. But as I reached for my car keys, Joe appeared in the doorway. Where do you think you're going? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. Work, I replied, trying to sidestep him. He blocked my path. We need to talk about last night. I'm going to be late, I insisted, my heart racing. I don't care, he growled, grabbing my arm. You embarrassed me in front of my mother. You're not leaving until we sort this out. I yanked my arm free, anger overriding fear. Sort what out, Joe? How you abandoned me, or how your mother treats me like a servant? His face darkened. Watch your tone. Mom's just trying to help. Help? I laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it? Before Joe could respond, Pat appeared behind him. Oh, good. You're both here. Danielle, I've made a list of chores that need doing today. I stared at her, incredulous. Pat, I have to go to work. She waved dismissively. Surely your little job can wait. Family comes first, after all. My little job pays half the bills around here, I snapped. Pat gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. Joseph, do you hear how she speaks to me? Joe's expression hardened. Apologize to my mother. Now. I looked between them, suddenly seeing clearly for the first time. This was my life now, caught between a manipulative mother-in-law and a husband who'd rather side with her than stand up for his wife. No, I said quietly. What did you say? Joe's voice was dangerously low. I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze. I said no. I'm done apologizing for existing. I'm done trying to please people who will never be satisfied. I'm going to work. I pushed past them both, ignoring Pat's theatrical sobs and Joe's angry calls. My hands shook as I started the car, but a strange calm settled over me as I pulled out of the driveway. At the office, Ellie took one look at my face and ushered me into the break room. "Spill," she demanded, pushing a cup of coffee into my hands. I told her everything. The abandonment, Pat's constant criticism, Joe's indifference. With each word, the weight on my chest lightened. "Danny," Ellie said gently when I finished, "you know this isn't normal, right? What they're doing to you, it's abuse." I flinched at the word, but deep down, I knew she was right. "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered. "Leave," she said simply. "You're strong, talented, and capable. You don't need them." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed, a text from Joe. "Come home now. We need to talk." I stared at the screen, my newfound resolve wavering. Then another message appeared. "If you're not here in 30 minutes, don't bother coming back at all." Something snapped inside me. I looked up at Ellie, a plan forming in my mind. "You're right," I said. "I don't need them. But I'm not just going to leave. They need to understand what they've done." Ellie's eyes widened. "What are you thinking?" I smiled, feeling truly alive for the first time in years. "I'm thinking it's time for a little payback. Are you with me?" Ellie grinned, squeezing my hand. "Always. What's the plan?" As I began to outline my idea, a thrill of excitement ran through me. Joe and Pat had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. I'd been walking on eggshells for days, waiting for the other shoe to drop after my confrontation with Joe and Pat. But nothing happened. No angry outbursts, no passive-aggressive comments, just an eerie calm that set my nerves on edge. Then, out of the blue, Joe approached me one evening, a strange glint in his eye. "Danny, I've been thinking. We've been through a rough patch lately, but I want to make it up to you." I eyed him warily. "What do you mean?" He smiled, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man I'd fallen in love with. "Our anniversary's coming up. I've got a surprise planned. A dinner show downtown, just the two of us." My heart skipped a beat. Could this be real? A chance to reconnect, to rebuild what we'd lost? "That sounds wonderful," I said cautiously, not daring to hope. Joe's smile widened. "Great. It's this Saturday. I'll pick you up at 7. As he walked away, I felt a flutter of excitement. Maybe things were finally turning around. Saturday arrived, and I spent hours getting ready, determined to make the most of this opportunity. When Joe's car pulled up, I hurried outside, only to stop short at the sight of Pat in the passenger seat. "Hello, Danielle," she chirped, her saccharine tone setting my teeth on edge. "Joseph invited me along. Isn't that thoughtful?" I looked at Joe, who shrugged apologetically. "Mom's been feeling down lately. I thought this might cheer her up." Swallowing my disappointment, I climbed into the back seat. So much for our romantic evening. The drive downtown was tense, filled with Pat's incessant chatter and Joe's monosyllabic responses. I stared out the window, wondering how I'd ended up here. Suddenly, Joe pulled over in a rundown neighborhood. "I need to make a quick stop," he announced. "Danny, can you run into that store and grab some aspirin? My head's killing me." Before I could protest, Pat chimed in. "Oh yes, and while you're there, be a dear and pick up some mints. My breath feels atrocious." Sighing, I got out of the car and headed towards the dingy convenience store. As I pushed open the door, a bell jingled overhead, startling me. The clerk eyed me suspiciously as I wandered the aisles, searching for aspirin and mints. When I finally found them and approached the counter, I realized with horror that I'd left my purse in the car. "I'm so sorry," I stammered. "I need to run back to the car for my wallet. I'll be right back." But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. The street was empty. Joe's car was gone. Panic seized me as the reality of the situation sank in. They'd left me. Again. But this time, it wasn't just Joe. Pat had been in on it too. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, only to remember it was in my purse. In the car, with them. Tears of frustration and anger welled up as I looked around the unfamiliar, threatening neighborhood. How could they do this to me? And on our anniversary, no less? A group of men loitering nearby noticed my distress, nudging each other and grinning. Fear gripped me as they started moving in my direction. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I was done being a victim. Done letting Joe and Pat manipulate and abuse me. This ends now, I thought fiercely. I ducked back into the store, ignoring the clerk's annoyed look. Please, I begged. I need to use your phone. It's an emergency. He hesitated, then nodded towards an ancient payphone in the corner. I rushed over, my fingers trembling as I dialed the only number I knew by heart. Ellie? I said when she answered. I need your help, and I'm ready to do what we talked about. It's time to make them pay. As I waited for Ellie to arrive, a plan began to form in my mind. Joe and Pat thought they'd broken me, but they'd only succeeded in igniting a fire they couldn't control. They wanted to play games? Fine. But they were about to learn that I could play too, and I played to win. Ellie's car screeched to a halt in front of the convenience store. I rushed out, relief flooding through me at the sight of my best friend. Danny, oh my God! Ellie exclaimed, pulling me into a fierce hug. Are you okay? What happened? I quickly filled her in on Joe's deception and Pat's involvement. Ellie's face darkened with each word. That's it, she growled. We're not letting them get away with this anymore. As we sped towards the dinner show venue, I felt a surge of determination. Ellie, remember that plan we talked about? I think it's time. She glanced at me, a slow smile spreading across her face. You sure? I nodded, my resolve strengthening. They've pushed me too far this time. It ends tonight. We arrived at the upscale restaurant just as Joe and Pat were being seated. Through the window, I could see them laughing, probably congratulating themselves on their cruel prank. Ready? Ellie asked, squeezing my hand. I took a deep breath. Ready. We strode into the restaurant, heads held high. Joe's face paled when he saw me, while Pat's mouth dropped open in shock. Danny? Joe stammered. How did you? Surprise, I said coldly. Did you really think you could just abandon me and get away with it? Pat recovered quickly, her voice dripping with fake concern. Danielle, dear, there must be some misunderstanding. We were so worried when you didn't come back to the car. I laughed bitterly. Save it, Pat. I know exactly what you two were up to. Joe stood up, his face thunderous. You're making a scene. Let's discuss this at home. Oh, we're way past that, Joe, I retorted. In fact, I think it's time everyone here knows exactly what kind of man you are. With that, Ellie stepped forward, producing a small device from her purse. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the now silent restaurant, we have a special presentation for you tonight. Before Joe or Pat could react, Ellie pressed a button and a projection appeared on the restaurant's blank wall. It was footage from our home security cameras. Scenes of Joe berating me, Pat's constant criticism, the emotional abuse I'd endured for years. Gasps echoed through the room as the truth of my life played out for all to see. Joe lunged for Ellie, but I stepped between them. Touch her and I'll have you arrested for assault, I warned. Joe's face contorted with rage. You think this changes anything? You're nothing without me, Danny. Nothing. His words, once so cutting, now bounced off me like pebbles. No, Joe, I was nothing with you, but that ends now. I turned to address the stunned onlookers. This is the reality of emotional abuse. It's insidious, it's devastating, and it has to stop. Murmurs of support rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman approached, tears in her eyes. You're so brave, dear. Don't let them hurt you anymore. Pat, seeing the tide turn against them, tried one last manipulation. Danielle, please, we're family. We can work this out. I met her gaze steadily. No, Pat, we're not family. Family doesn't treat each other this way. As security arrived to escort Joe and Pat out, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Ellie wrapped an arm around me, beaming with pride. You did it, Danny. You stood up to them. I nodded, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. It's not over yet, though. This is just the beginning. As we watched Joe and Pat being led away, their faces red with humiliation, I knew I'd reached a turning point. There was no going back now. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the future. I turned to Ellie, a fierce determination in my voice. Let's finish this. It's time to reclaim my life. With that, we walked out of the restaurant, heads held high, ready to face whatever came next. The old Danny, meek, submissive, afraid, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth and was ready to fight for it. Joe and Pat had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned and empowered. My heart raced as Ellie and I entered the grand ballroom where the anniversary dinner show was being held. The room buzzed with excitement, unsuspecting guests mingling and laughing, if only they knew the drama about to unfold. "You ready for this?" Ellie whispered, squeezing my hand. I nodded, steeling myself. As ready as I'll ever be. We'd spent the past week meticulously planning this moment. Ellie, using her connections in the events industry, had managed to get herself appointed as the evening's MC. Now, as she took the stage, I felt a mix of anticipation and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ellie's voice rang out, silencing the crowd. "Welcome to tonight's special performance. We have a unique show for you this evening. A tale of love, betrayal, and redemption." I scanned the room, spotting Joe and Pat near the front. They looked confused, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Ellie continued, her voice taking on a serious tone. "But before we begin, I'd like to share a real-life story with you all. A story about a woman named Danny." Joe's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. He started to stand, but Pat grabbed his arm, hissing something in his ear. On the large screen behind Ellie, images began to play. Security camera footage from our home, text messages, voicemails, all evidence of the emotional abuse I'd endured for years. Gasps echoed through the room as Joe's cruel words filled the air. "You're worthless, Danny. You'd be nothing without me." Pat's voice followed, dripping with venom. "Really, Danielle, I don't know how you expect to keep a husband if you can't even keep a tidy home." I watched as the audience's expressions changed from shock to outrage. Some people were crying, others looked ready to confront Joe and Pat themselves. Ellie's voice cut through the murmurs. "This is the reality of emotional abuse. It's silent, it's insidious, and it destroys lives. But tonight, we're breaking that silence." She gestured towards me, and suddenly, all eyes in the room were on me. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to the real Danny Brown." My legs felt like lead as I made my way to the stage. Joe stood up, his face contorted with rage. "Danny, don't you dare." "Sit down, Mr. Ferguson," a security guard warned, placing a hand on Joe's shoulder. As I reached the microphone, I took a deep breath. This was it. No turning back now. "For years," I began, my voice shaking slightly, "I've lived in fear. I've been belittled, manipulated, and made to feel worthless, but no more." I locked eyes with Joe, feeling a surge of strength. "Joe Ferguson, I want you to hear this loud and clear. I am divorcing you. I am reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my freedom." The room erupted in applause. I saw Pat trying to drag Joe towards the exit, but security blocked their path. "And Patricia," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "your days of manipulating and abusing me are over. You too thought you could break me, but you only made me stronger." As I spoke, I felt years of pain and anger pouring out of me. The audience hung on every word, their support palpable. Suddenly, Joe broke free from the security guard, charging towards the stage. "You ungrateful bitch," he roared, "after everything I've done for you." Time seemed to slow down. I saw the fury in Joe's eyes, the desperation of a man losing control. For a moment, fear gripped me. Had I pushed too far? But before Joe could reach me, several audience members tackled him to the ground. As security dragged him away, his screams echoing through the ballroom, I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid anymore. I turned back to the microphone, my voice steady and clear. "To anyone out there suffering in silence, you are not alone, you are strong, and you deserve better." As the room erupted in a standing ovation, I felt tears streaming down my face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of relief, of freedom, of hope. Ellie rushed to my side, enveloping me in a fierce hug. "You did it, Danny," she whispered. "You're free." And as I looked out over the sea of supportive faces, I knew she was right. The battle wasn't over. There would be legal fights ahead, no doubt. But in that moment, I had won the war for my soul, and nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of my public declaration was chaos. Security guards struggled to restrain Joe as he thrashed and hurled obscenities. Pat's shrill voice cut through the commotion. "You ungrateful wretch. After everything we've done for you." I stood my ground, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "What you've done is abuse me, manipulate me, and try to break my spirit. But not anymore." As Joe was dragged towards the exit, he managed to break free momentarily. His eyes, wild with rage, locked onto mine. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "I'll destroy you, Danny." You'll have nothing when I'm done with you. A chill ran down my spine, but I refused to show fear. Ellie stepped forward, placing herself between Joe and me. The only one who's finished here is you, Joe, she said coldly. Security finally managed to remove Joe and Pat from the ballroom, their angry shouts fading as they were escorted out of the building. The room buzzed with shocked murmurs and words of support. An older woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "You're so brave, dear. I wish I'd had your courage years ago." Her words hit me hard. How many others had suffered in silence like I had? Suddenly my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You'll regret this, Danny. Watch your back." I showed Ellie, my hands shaking. "It's starting already," I whispered. She squeezed my shoulder. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but you're not alone anymore." As if on cue, a man in a crisp suit approached us. "Mrs. Ferguson? I'm David Lawson, an attorney. I'd like to offer my services pro bono. What you've endured is unacceptable, and I want to help ensure you get the justice you deserve." Before I could respond, another voice chimed in. "And I'm Sarah Chen from the Women's Crisis Center. We have resources to help you through this transition." Overwhelmed, I looked at Ellie, who nodded encouragingly. "See, you have support now." As we made our way out of the ballroom, a crowd had gathered outside. News of what happened had spread quickly. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes blinded me. "Mrs. Ferguson, how long have you been suffering this abuse? Do you fear retaliation from your husband? What message do you have for other women in abusive relationships?" I froze, the weight of the moment crushing down on me. This was more than I'd bargained for. What if I said the wrong thing? What if Joe used this against me? Ellie sensed my panic and stepped in. "No comments at this time. Please respect Mrs. Ferguson's privacy." As we pushed through the crowd, I spotted a familiar face, my old boss from the art gallery. "Danny," she called out, "if you need a job, there's always a place for you with us." Tears welled up in my eyes. After years of isolation, here was a lifeline to my old life, my true self. We finally made it to Ellie's car, shutting out the chaos outside. I slumped in the seat, exhausted and overwhelmed. "What have I done, Ellie?" I whispered. "Joe's right. He'll try to destroy me. What if I lose everything?" Ellie turned to me, her expression fierce. "Listen to me, Danny. You've already won the most important battle. You've reclaimed your voice, your dignity. Everything else? We'll face it together." As we drove away, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Joe. "Hope you enjoyed your little show. See you in court, bitch." I stared at the message, a mix of fear and determination coursing through me. The road ahead would be hard, possibly dangerous. Joe wouldn't go down without a fight, and Pat would use every manipulative trick she knew. But as I looked at Ellie, thought of the supporters I'd gained tonight, I felt a spark of hope. For the first time in years, I wasn't facing my battles alone. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. "Okay," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "What's our next move?" Ellie grinned, a glint of determination in her eye. Now we fight back, and we win." As we sped into the night, I knew the war was far from over. But I was finally ready for battle. Joe and Pat had no idea what was coming their way. The woman they'd tried to break was about to show them just how strong she really was. The courtroom buzzed with tension as I took my seat, Ellie's reassuring presence beside me. Across the aisle, Joe sat with his lawyer, his face a mask of cold fury. Pat wasn't far behind, her eyes narrowed in contempt. "All rise," the bailiff called out. As Judge Harriet Simmons entered, I felt a flutter of hope. She was known for her fair rulings in domestic cases. "We're here today for the divorce proceedings of Danielle Brown versus Joseph Ferguson," Judge Simmons began. "I understand there are some unusual circumstances surrounding this case." Joe's lawyer stood up, his voice dripping with false concern. "Your Honor, my client has been the victim of a vicious smear campaign. Mrs. Ferguson's public spectacle was nothing more than attention-seeking behavior." I clenched my fists, anger rising in my chest. But before I could react, my lawyer, David Lawson, was on his feet. "Your Honor, we have extensive evidence of Mr. Ferguson's emotional abuse and manipulation, including security footage, text messages, and eyewitness accounts from the night Mrs. Ferguson bravely spoke out." As David presented the evidence, I watched Joe's face. His cool facade cracked, revealing the rage beneath. Pat shifted uncomfortably in her seat, no doubt realizing her role in the abuse was about to be exposed. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and approached the stand. Looking directly at Joe, I spoke clearly and firmly. For years, I lived in fear. I was belittled, manipulated, and made to feel worthless. But standing here today, I realize that the only worthless thing in my life was the way I was treated. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'm not just asking for a divorce. I'm asking for a chance to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my future. As I returned to my seat, I caught a glimpse of Pat's face. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The judge called a brief recess to review the evidence. Those minutes felt like hours. But when she returned, her expression was resolute. In light of the overwhelming evidence of emotional abuse and manipulation, I'm granting the divorce in favor of Mrs. Brown. Mr. Ferguson, you will pay alimony and cover Mrs. Brown's legal fees. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order against both you and your mother, Patricia Macy. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. It was over. I was free. Joe exploded, leaping to his feet. This is bullshit. You can't do this to me. As security restrained him, Pat rushed forward. Danielle, please. We can work this out. We're family. I stood tall, meeting her gaze. No, Pat, we're not family. Family doesn't treat each other the way you treated me. As Joe and Pat were escorted out, their angry shouts fading, I turned to Ellie. Tears streamed down both our faces as we embraced. You did it, Danny, she whispered. You're free. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. To my surprise, I saw familiar faces, my old co-workers from the art gallery, neighbors who had witnessed Joe's cruelty, even some of the people from the dinner show. My former boss stepped forward. Danny, the job offer still stands, whenever you're ready. Overwhelmed by the support, I could only nod gratefully. As Ellie and I made our way through the crowd, a young woman approached me hesitantly. Mrs. Brown? Your story? It gave me the courage to leave my own abusive relationship. Thank you. In that moment, I realized that my pain hadn't been for nothing. By speaking out, I had potentially saved others from suffering the same fate. Weeks later, I stood in the doorway of my new apartment, boxes scattered around me. Ellie appeared behind me, grinning as she hefted another box. Welcome home, Rumi, she said. I smiled, taking in the space that was all mine, a symbol of my newfound freedom and independence. As we unpacked, my phone buzzed. A text from David. Just heard. Joe and Pat left town. Looks like they couldn't handle the backlash. I showed Ellie, both of us laughing in disbelief. It was really over. That night, as we sat on the balcony sharing a bottle of wine, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. You know, I said, looking out at the city lights, for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about the future. Ellie clinked her glass against mine. Here's to new beginnings, and to the amazing woman who fought for her freedom. As we toasted, I realized that while my journey had been painful, it had led me here, to a place of strength, independence, and hope. Joe and Pat had tried to break me, but in the end, they had only made me stronger. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that the best was yet.